This scar in the Saudi desert was supposed to become home to 9 million people. Two mirrored walls, taller than the Empire State Building, would run 170 kilometers from the Red Sea into the mountains. There would be no cars, no streets, and eventually no operational carbon emissions. But in 2026, further work was reportedly pushed beyond 2030. The most ambitious city ever proposed had collided with something even larger than its budget: the land, the people, and the mathematics of cities. Officially, the line has not been cancelled. NEOM, the Saudi development company behind it, now says construction will proceed in phases, guided by demand. Earthworks have taken place, contracts have been awarded, and some regional infrastructure continues. Yet the language has changed. The original images promised a continuous city that would redefine urban life. The current language promises patience, flexibility, and a much longer horizon. This makes the line more interesting than a simple story of success or failure. It is the story of a country trying to redesign its economy, its image, and even everyday life by drawing one perfect line through an imperfect landscape. To understand why that line stalled, we first have to understand why it was drawn here. NEOM occupies a vast corner of northwestern Saudi Arabia in the province of Tabuk. It faces the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea, with Jordan to the north and Egypt across the water. On a regional map, this is where Arabia leans toward Africa, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. Shipping routes lead south through the Red Sea and north toward the Suez Canal. Political borders meet landscapes that have never obeyed them. From a distant satellite view, the region can look empty. Closer to the ground, it breaks into very different worlds. There are coral coasts and clear blue water, broad gravel plains, red sandstone formations, high mountains, deep valleys, and desert plateaus that can turn surprisingly cold in winter. NEOM itself describes four natural zones: coast, coastal desert, mountains, and elevated valleys. People have crossed and inhabited this region for centuries. Tabuk stood on caravan routes, linking southern Arabia with Syria. Pilgrims traveling from the Levant toward Medina and Mecca passed through this landscape, stopping where water and shelter made movement possible. In the early 20th century, the Hejaz Railway followed the same larger logic, connecting Damascus with Medina through a chain of stations, wells, forts, and settlements. That history matters because the desert was never simply space between important places. It was a network of routes, seasonal knowledge, tribal territory, and carefully remembered sources of water. Earlier lines through Tabuk adapted themselves to those realities. The line proposed something different. Instead of connecting existing destinations, the route itself would become a single destination, one building stretching from the sea deep into the interior. The location was strategically seductive. It offered access to a global shipping corridor, dramatic scenery for tourism, space for new industry, and physical distance from Saudi Arabia's older cities. It was close enough to Europe, Asia, and Africa to be marketed as a new international crossroads. Most importantly, it gave planners what appeared to be a blank canvas on which a new Saudi future could be displayed at unprecedented scale. When Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced the line in January 2021, the first version already rejected the familiar city. No roads, no private cars, no suburban sprawl. Daily needs would be available within a 5-minute walk, while fast public transport would connect communities along the route. In 2022, the concept became even more dramatic. Two parallel mirrored structures, each 500 meters high, separated by a space just 200 meters wide. The numbers were designed to overwhelm. The complete master plan would extend 170 kilometers, while occupying only about 34 square kilometers of land. Its population of 9 million would be larger than that of many countries. Its walls would rise higher than almost every building on Earth, then continue across a distance that a car traveling at highway speed would still need nearly 2 hours to cover seen from outside. The city would appear as a polished barrier reflecting desert, mountain, and sky. Inside, promotional images showed trees, waterfalls, stadiums, offices, homes, and public spaces stacked vertically beneath a long ribbon of light. Instead of expanding outward, the city would grow upward. Instead of organizing life around roads, it would organize life around elevators, walkways, local transit, and a high-speed rail spine. The environmental argument was as important as the spectacle. Extreme density would allow development on a small footprint, Nebraska OHM said, leaving most of the surrounding region for nature. A car-free design would eliminate traffic, parking lots, and tailpipe pollution. Energy would eventually come from renewable sources. Water would be desalinated, wastewater reused, and digital systems would coordinate services in real time. It looked like science fiction because that was part of its function. The line did not merely offer apartments or offices. It offered an escape from the frustrations of the 20th century city: congestion, long commutes, polluted air, unequal access, and endless expansion. Yet the central idea was not new. More than a century before Saudi Arabia revealed its mirrored walls, another planner had tried to solve the city with a line. In 1882, Spanish planner Arturo Soria y Mata proposed the Ciudad Lineal. Madrid was industrializing, overcrowding was worsening, and traditional urban centers were becoming unhealthy and expensive. Soria imagined a long settlement built around a tramway. Homes, utilities, gardens, and public facilities would extend along a transport spine, giving residents access to both the city and the countryside. His idea was social as well as geometric. Public transport would connect different classes. Infrastructure could expand in an orderly way. Nature would remain close to every home. Soria's planned city was meant to reach nearly 50 kilometers, but only a little more than 5 was built. Over time, Madrid grew around it. Roads widened, buildings changed, and the original ideal became an ordinary urban district. The concept survived. Soviet planners adapted linear cities to industrial production. Other architects used corridors to organize settlements along rivers, railways, or coastlines. Linear growth works especially well when geography is already linear. A port, a valley, or a transport corridor can produce long cities naturally. The difficulty begins when the line is chosen first, and every human and physical system is forced to follow it. Each age gives the linear city its favorite technology. Soria had the electric tram, the Soviet planners had the factory, and Neom had artificial intelligence, high-speed rail, and renewable energy. What Saudi Arabia added was extraordinary height, density, and symbolism. The shape was old. The scale was revolutionary. That scale only makes sense inside Saudi Arabia's larger transformation. Vision 2030, launched in 2016, is often summarized as a plan to prepare for a world after oil. The real motivation is more immediate. Oil can remain valuable for decades while still producing unstable revenue, limited private sector employment, and vulnerability to forces Saudi Arabia cannot control. A young population needs jobs, housing, entertainment, and reasons to build a future at home. The kingdom has already changed in ways that would have seemed unlikely a decade earlier. Cinemas reopened, concerts, sporting events, and large entertainment seasons became common. Tourist visas expanded access beyond religious and business travel. Historic places such as Alula were turned into global destinations. Women entered a wider range of workplaces and public activities. These changes are uneven and tightly directed from above, but they are not imaginary. Vision 2030 also treats culture as an economic resource. Heritage, landscape, food, art, pilgrimage, and national identity can attract visitors and investment. New industries can create careers that do not depend directly on oil ports, and logistics can use the kingdom's location between 3 continents. The line combined all these ambitions into one object that could be understood in a single image. For Saudi leaders, a conventional new town would never have carried the same message. The United Arab Emirates had already built a global brand around Dubai. Qatar had used aviation, media, culture, and sport to amplify its influence. Saudi Arabia, much larger and more populous than either, wanted an image equal to its ambitions. A 170-kilometer mirrored city was not simply infrastructure. It was a declaration that the center of the future could move. Calling the line only a vanity project misses this strategic purpose. Spectacle can attract attention, talent, contractors, tourists, and capital. Large projects can accelerate roads, ports, energy systems, and institutional change even when the original design evolves. But spectacle also creates a trap. Once the image becomes the promise, any compromise looks like defeat, and practical questions can be treated as failures of imagination. The line also concentrated decision, making around one powerful vision. A city normally emerges from thousands of negotiations among residents, businesses, landowners, planners, and governments. Here, the form was established before a population existed. The future residents were imagined as users of a system designed for them that made speed and coherence possible on paper. It also made it easier to overlook the people already living on the land. The phrase blank canvas is common in descriptions of new cities, but land is rarely blank to those who know it. The Neom region includes villages and territories long associated with the Huaytat, also spelled Hawatat, a large tribal community whose history extends across parts of modern Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Sinai. Some families lived in settled villages. Others maintained relationships with grazing land and routes that cannot be reduced to a house deed or a point on a map. In 2020, residents of villages including Al-Karaiba, Sharma, and Gayal were told that land would be acquired for Neom. Human rights groups and United Nations experts later raised concerns about forced eviction, inadequate consultation, compensation, arrests, long prison sentences, and death sentences imposed on some opponents. A resident named Abdul Rahim Al-Huwaiti was killed during a security operation after publicly resisting removal. Accounts of the confrontation differ, but his death became a symbol of the human cost attached to the project. Saudi authorities have rejected key allegations. They have said residents were consulted, compensation was provided, and relocated communities received housing, training, education, and development opportunities. They have also maintained that criminal cases involve security offenses rather than peaceful criticism alone. Those responses are part of the record, as are continuing concerns from international monitors about whether people had meaningful choice and effective remedies. This is more than a dispute over compensation. A development plan measures land by area, price, and future productivity. A community may measure the same land through ancestry, memory, access, and belonging. When those systems collide, the side with political power usually defines what counts. The mirrored city promised to preserve nature outside its narrow footprint. But footprint calculations do not capture the cultural geography that construction can divide. The workforce introduces another layer. Saudi Arabia's Giga projects depend heavily on migrant labor from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and elsewhere in the Arab world. Investigations across the sector have documented recruitment debts, wage theft, restrictions on changing jobs, dangerous heat, and limited access to help. Those findings do not mean every worker at Neom experienced abuse, and broad death figures circulated online should not be presented as deaths caused by the line. They do show that a futuristic city can still rely on an old and unequal labor system. By this point, the problem is no longer simply whether the towers can stand. It is whether a city can be called sustainable if the people who lose land or build it have little influence over its design, even if every social conflict disappeared. However, the geometry would create a challenge of its own. The line's most attractive promise is the 5-minute walk. A resident could reach groceries, green space, healthcare, and other daily services without a car. In a well-designed neighborhood, that is entirely plausible. Density supports shops and transit. Vertical construction shortens some journeys. Removing roads gives space back to people. The confusion begins when neighborhood proximity is treated as city-wide proximity. A-line is the shape that spreads its points farthest apart. Researchers who modeled the full city found that two randomly selected residents would live an average of 57 kilometers from one another. If walking distance is defined as 1 kilometer, a resident could reach only about 1.2% of the population on foot. The same 34 square kilometer footprint arranged as a circle would reduce the average separation to about 2.9 kilometers and place roughly 24% of residents within a 1 kilometer walk. That comparison does not prove that a circular city of 9 million people would be comfortable or easy to build. A circle with the same extreme density would create its own problems with light, ventilation, evacuation, and public space. The point is mathematical. A compact two-dimensional network creates many possible paths between destinations. A one-dimensional city forces most longer journeys onto the same axis. The railway, therefore, has to perform contradictory tasks. The original promise of crossing 170 kilometers in 20 minutes requires an average speed of about 510 kilometers per HR before accounting for stops, acceleration, braking, or the vertical trip from an apartment to a platform. Add many stations and everyone can reach a train, but the service loses speed. Build only a few stations and express travel becomes faster, but residents spend more time walking, riding elevators, or transferring between local and long-distance systems. Designers could respond with local and express services, multiple levels of transit, intelligent scheduling, and neighborhoods that reduce the need for cross-city travel. Those are real solutions. They also make the system more complex and expensive. Every elevator platform, power supply, ventilation shaft, and digital control becomes part of a chain. When one part fails, the the advantage of a single integrated spine can become a vulnerability. Cities are not only collections of daily needs. People change jobs, attend universities, visit relatives, form communities, worship, celebrate, and seek specialized care. Businesses depend on suppliers and customers beyond one neighborhood. Cultural life often gathers in places that serve an entire city. The line could duplicate every service repeatedly, but then its neighborhoods risk becoming isolated modules, or it could concentrate major institutions, forcing long journeys back onto the rail system. This is the human problem hidden inside perfect geometry. A city is efficient, partly because it allows unpredictable connections. Its streets form networks, its centers overlap, and its residents continually create new patterns that planners did not foresee. The line tried to remove urban disorder. In doing so, it risked removing the redundancy and flexibility that help real cities survive. Then and there is the physical landscape. The proposed route begins near the sea and crosses desert, rock, valleys, and mountains. A continuous foundation would encounter changing geology and drainage. Roads and animal routes would need crossings. Construction materials and equipment would have to move through an enormous site. Even if the city were built in independent modules, the systems connecting them would still extend over a continental scale. Water is the clearest constraint. NEOM plans to meet its needs through desalination powered by renewable energy, with wastewater recycled and useful minerals recovered from concentrated brine. The wider regional plan has described hundreds of kilometers of pipelines carrying water from the coast to inland communities. These technologies are feasible. Saudi Arabia already operates desalination at vast scale. The challenge is supplying a city of 9 million while minimizing energy use, marine damage, and waste. Desalination separates fresh water from salt, but the salt does not disappear. Conventional plants return hot, concentrated brine and treatment chemicals to the sea, potentially affecting marine habitats. NEOM has proposed advanced processes intended to reduce or eliminate that discharge. If successful, they could be valuable far beyond the line. But using unproven systems at unprecedented scale adds risk, especially when the Red Sea coast contains sensitive reefs and breeding areas. The energy promise has a similar tension. A city operating without private cars and powered by renewables could have a lower daily footprint than a sprawling automobile metropolis. Yet, operating carbon is only part of the story. Towers 500 meters high require extraordinary quantities of concrete, steel, glass, and supporting infrastructure. Producing those materials creates emissions before the first resident switches on a light. The mirrored exterior creates both identity and engineering work. Glass must withstand heat, wind, dust, temperature changes, and constant maintenance. Reflected sunlight and the enclosed space can affect local microclimates. The wall would also cut across ecological movement. Conservation experts have warned about migratory birds using the Red Sea flyway and about animals moving through mountain corridors. A long reflective barrier could be difficult for wildlife to interpret or cross. NEOM says development will occupy only a small portion of the region and that the remainder will be protected or restored. It has supported wildlife monitoring, rewilding, and marine research. Those efforts should not be dismissed. They also reveal the contradiction at the center of the project. Preserving a large percentage of land does not automatically neutralize a barrier placed across the routes that connect ecosystems. None of these challenges makes a shorter vertical district impossible. Engineers routinely solve problems that once seemed absurd. Skyscrapers stand in earthquake zones. Desert cities supply millions of people with water. Rail networks move entire populations each day. The question is not whether any piece can be built. It is whether every piece can be integrated across 170 kilometers at a cost, speed, and environmental standard that the original promise requires. By 2024, the public timetable had begun to acknowledge that gap. Earlier expectations had placed about 1.5 million people across NEOM by 2030. Bloomberg reported that the wider population expectation had fallen below 300,000, while only about 2.4 kilometers of the line were expected by the end of the decade. Saudi officials emphasized that the city had always been intended to grow in phases. Both statements can be true. Phasing was built into the plan, while the near-term physical ambition had become far smaller than many early presentations suggested. The construction in the desert was not entirely fictional. Workers excavated long trenches, installed piles, moved enormous quantities of earth, built camps, and developed roads and utilities. Satellite images made the site visible from orbit. This activity demonstrated commitment, but it did not answer the central question. Digging a foundation corridor is very different from completing a functioning 500-meter city. filled with homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, and public life, owe their warning signs accumulated across Neom. Costs rose, deadlines slipped, leadership changed, and the kingdom reviewed which projects could produce practical returns sooner. In January 2026, the Asian Winter Games planned for Neom's mountain resort at Trojena were indefinitely postponed. Trojena is separate from the line, but the decision showed that even internationally announced deadlines could be renegotiated. Then, in April 2026, PIF Governor Yasir Al-Rumayyan made the new priority unusually clear. He said no Neom projects had been cancelled, but completing the line by 2030 was not a must. What Neom must have, he said, was Oxagon, the industrial port. That same day, PIF's new strategy emphasized capital efficiency, financial returns, and greater private investment after years of rapid expansion. On May 21, 2026, the Italian contractor WeBuild announced that Neom had terminated a contract for a high-speed connector railway near Sharma. The project had already been suspended and was about 20% complete. This was not the internal railway promised beneath the line, so it should not be confused with a formal cancellation of the city. It was still a concrete sign that regional priorities were changing. One day later, reporting based on people familiar with Neom's review said further work on the line would be delayed until after 2030, and that the mirrored design would be reconsidered. The same report described a shift toward immediately productive infrastructure, including the port and industrial development at Oxagon, utilities, and data connectivity. Neom did not publicly confirm a final cancellation. Its current position is more careful. The line remains part of the long-term vision, advancing through a phased demand-led approach. That phrase leaves almost every possibility open. A short district could eventually rise. The design could change. Construction could resume when finances, technology, or demand improve. The complete 170-kilometer wall could remain an aspiration with no fixed completion date. That ambiguity is politically useful. If the line were declared cancelled, the mirrored wall would become a monument to overreach before it existed. If the original schedule were defended, every missed deadline would deepen the embarrassment. A flexible horizon protects the symbol while allowing budgets and engineering plans to change. It also turns the project into something difficult to judge. Almost any excavation can be described as a first phase, and almost any delay can be presented as patience, as long as the ultimate completion date remains undefined. Money matters, but it is not the entire explanation. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund is financing multiple transformations at once. Expo 2030 in Riyadh, the 2034 Football World Cup, Qiddiya, Diriyah, airports, housing, industrial zones, ports, and data centers. Oil revenue remains enormous, but it is not limitless, especially while the state is trying to reduce dependence on the same resource funding the transition. The price of the line is also harder to define than headlines suggest. The original figure above $500 billion covered all of Neom, not the mirrored city alone. Estimates above $1 trillion came from media reports, not an audited plan. No public total exists for the original 170-kilometer version. Ports, data centers, and utilities can produce returns sooner than a mirrored city waiting for millions of residents. The line needs an entire urban ecosystem before its value becomes clear. Its delay, therefore, looks less like abandoning transformation than making it selective. Vision 2030 is larger than Neom, and Neom is larger than the line. Saudi tourism, infrastructure, and social life have already changed. One design cannot summarize an entire country. The line may still leave useful technology behind. Work on renewable desalination, car-free neighborhoods, modular construction, digital infrastructure, and ecosystem monitoring could influence smaller developments. Regional utilities may support another form of settlement. Even an unfinished megaproject can produce knowledge, though at extraordinary cost. But the original vision revealed a recurring mistake in the history of planned cities. It treated urban life as a problem that could be solved by selecting the correct shape. If the geometry were pure enough, technology advanced enough, and authority coordinated enough, disorder would disappear. Real cities refuse that bargain. They change because people change, and they work because they contain choices the original planner did not design. Saudi Arabia can build a post-oil future in the Northwest. It can create ports, destinations, research centers, homes, and public spaces. What it cannot do is make geography irrelevant. Water still begins at the sea, mountains still interrupt foundations, birds still follow ancient flyways, communities still attach memory to land. Residents still form relationships that refuse to remain inside a 5-minute module. From space, the excavation resembles a straight scar. On the ground, the story is far less straight. It passes through an old pilgrimage corridor, a tribal homeland, a global labor system, an urban experiment, and a nation moving through one of the fastest transformations in its history. The pause in 2026 did not settle whether the line will ever rise. It revealed how much the original image had concealed. On a map, a line is the shortest distance between 2 points, but a city is made from all the detours between them. A market, a mosque, a neighbor, a memory, a place people choose to stay. The line was designed to conquer distance. Instead, it exposed every distance Saudi Arabia still has to cross, from oil to a new economy, from spectacle to community, and from a blank map to a living landscape. The future may still be built here, it just may not be a line.